nowadays. Well. Yeah. So it is relatively rare, of course, if you compare this to other motor speech disorders. So it most frequently occurs after significant neurological damage, so damage to the central nervous system, sometimes causes the syndrome, but it's not only damage to the neurological system in a technical sense, but also sometimes psychogenic factors that play a role. Probably useful to point out, it's the only motor speech disorder that is really strongly defined in perceptual terms. So it's a couple of an articulatory setting, you could say, that has emerged as a result of neurological damage, and that these changes in articulation essentially give rise to the impression of a foreign or a different regional accent, because that is also, in fact, quite common. And so I highlight this because obviously this does not have anything to do with learning a different language, with probably to some extent maybe imitating a particular accent, depending on the type of speaker involved. But I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And it's not the result. I mean, a real foreign accent in a language, I would imagine, is, somehow the result of lack of successful learning, if you want to look at it in a philosophical perspective. But this is not the result of unsuccessful language learning. It occurs as the result of loss of ability or planning issues that may go wrong. I mean, that's undecided, really. They're reported in the UK quite a lot. Speakers with foreign accent syndrome, usually between the months of June and September. Not much news around, and then obviously very often this features in the news and can provide a floor for specific types of speakers also to shine, in a sense. I would say that you could legitimately distinguish between three types of foreign accent speakers, foreign accent syndrome speakers. So you have a class, and that's definitely the biggest, neurogenic. So speakers that develop the accent on the basis of neurological insult. So most often, that is stroke, the result of stroke that causes damage, particularly in the regions of the brain associated with the planning and execution of speech, so left hemisphere in most speakers. But also trauma in that area, inflammations in that area, but more generally, anything that can compromise connections in the brain relevant for speech production, dementia, multiple sclerosis, have been associated with this syndrome quite often, in fact. Also, or the result of damage caused by surgical intervention. I think I have a speaker here that I didn't play last time, is in fact a speaker who had surgery to the jaw to corrective surgery that seemed to have had an effect on the mechanical functioning of the jaw, and that leads to an accent. And I'll leave you to decide. I just wish I could play all French examples. But in fact, since that first description in 1907, I mean, there's only two patients that have been described with a French accent, not in France, but in Canada. And I don't have any recordings from them. So, and it's often obviously in assessing the type of accent involved is obviously hugely dependent on experience on the source language, the target language, and so on. So I hope at least, I think I've always done English examples here. So I'm sorry about that. But it may be more informative than playing you Dutch examples that can also be problematic. Not in a prosodic sense, but a segmental sense. Okay, let me just play the first one.
Went in December 2015.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. For routine operation, this was have your jaw realigned to correct an overbite. And it was your husband that first noticed that your accent had changed.
Yes. After waking up from surgery, I had asked him if he could hand me my cellular phone. I wanted to text my sister and let her know that I was okay and out of surgery. And that's when he first noticed. And then as I kept talking to him throughout the day, he's like, Lisa, you're kind of talking funny. And I said, well, they told you I was going to talk funny after surgery, like you might not understand me. He's like, no, you're talking funny. And he really wasn't explaining too much about an accent. He just said I sounded different. So I just thought it was part of like the swelling from the surgery and that, you know, he wasn't understanding what I was saying. So I just kept repeating myself over and over.
Kayla, what do you think?
At first, I thought she was joking with me. Like, I didn't think she was serious, but then after a while, her doctor told me, and I knew that she wasn't joking because she wouldn't have been joking with me for that long. And then, well, like now I'm used to her accent, and I kind of like it now.
Well, we're picking all sorts of different bits.
There's a bit of Australian in there,
a little bit of Yorkshire, a little bit of Brummie, Birmingham. So there's all sorts of different bits of accent, and you have no idea why that would happen because, as we said in the introduction, I mean, you don't, watch British TV. You've never been to Britain.
No, never.
That's like it is like that was Australian.
I know that was kind of Australian.
We've got some footage of your old accent. So let's just run this in. This is what you did sound like.
We just want you to know how blessed we are to have you guys as our pastors, not only to lead us and guide us, but you guys have inspired us and befriended us, and we love you.
Does it feel weird when you hear your old accent?
No, I actually hear it on a daily basis. Whenever I'm not speaking out loud and I'm thinking to myself in my mind, I hear my old voice. And in my dreams, I hear my old voice. So although friends and family sometimes tell me, I don't even remember what you would sound like before. I tell them, oh, well, I get to hear it every day. So it's hard for me to understand that they forget it because I get to hear it every day still.
And for you, I mean, you're used to it now, but initially when you first started to speak like this, you sort of drew into yourself a bit and were very self-conscious.
Yes, I mean, when I first started listening for it, I didn't hear it at first, but once my husband and my sister let me know, like, you're kind of talking with an accent, I started listening for it, and as I started hearing it, I started to see myself talking less and less.
And that continues for a bit, but I don't find it difficult to be convinced that sounds like a British English accent, rhythmic structure, sounds as if it has changed with respect to the pre-morbid situation. A couple of vowels that are really British and English, particularly that I sort of stands out to my ears in the discussion. And I wonder, I mean, in any case, it's different from her original, I think it was a Texas accent in American English. Those are quite different. Interesting also, the daughter is very supportive in this. Oh, I like it actually, I like that new accent. So provides support here, which is nice to see. So that's neurogenic, you could say. In this case, I mean, I haven't seen this published in the scientific literature, but the result of probably surgical damage that may have caused the change. Second type is far less frequent, not very well documented, is in fact a psychogenic or functional type of foreign accent syndrome, where the accent results from psychological issues that the speaker is trying to deal with. Conversion disorder is a classic example. I mean, we remind you of the Freudian studies in hysteria, for example, where you have Anna O as a very famous example of a speaker who developed speech and language issues. We don't want any updates now. Thank you. We've been lucky, actually, to see a couple of patients like that. Very recently also, a couple of months ago, in fact, have been reports on social media where you have this young lady who all of a sudden develops an accent claiming to be the result of migraine attacks that she was suffering from. I have no evidence for this. This is just a loose claim, but I have an impression that this is a good example of a psychogenic foreign accent. And I'm saying this because those are typical, the speakers who contact the media. So they don't go and see a doctor, no, they contact the media and in fact tell the media, I have foreign accent syndrome, or they contact medics and tell them, I have foreign accent syndrome, and in fact know the ins and outs of the syndrome, and even can quote titles of papers that have been published on the syndrome. So they are very often very well informed. Let me just play here. I think the accent change is massive again. You'll notice.
Now, imagine going to sleep and then waking up with a completely different accent. Well, that's exactly what happened to our next guest.
Yeah, so 26-year-old Verity was born, raised in the West Midlands, but after taking a nap to cope with a migraine, she woke up sounding completely different.
Yeah, before Verity shows us her new accent, let's take a little listen of what she used to sound like from one of her old videos.
Putting like a few in just under here so that like you can see the blonde through. Don't want like loads. And then obviously every time my hair grows and I have to take them out and get them redone, I'll just, because then if I'm using all of them and cutting them off, like I won't be able to use them again because my hair's growing. So if I just use like a few at a time and just put them like, I don't know, obviously you know the placement better than me, but it's just so that like you can see a bit more of the blonde in it, and when I'm like, woo, you can see.
Okay, so kind of regular kind of West Midlands, right? And then since October last year, Verity has had a Geordie accent despite having never been to Newcastle. She joins us now to tell us more. What a strange thing to happen to you. I mean, I've read a lot about this before. I think we maybe talked to a couple of people about it before. But just to reiterate, never been to Newcastle?
No, never. I've been to like surrounding areas, but for like a long weekend when I was like 13. So not enough time to pick something up.
And you say it's completely changed your whole personality?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, completely. Like, I'm so much more confident now, and I'm very, I think in myself more. I used to be quite a people pleaser, you know, I'd get upset a lot over a lot of things, whereas now I just do everything for myself. I'm very, like, black and white in thinking now, if that makes sense, which I don't know if necessarily a good thing, but it's definitely improved for myself.
Do you prefer this, like, new version of yourself?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. I don't want it to change. Don't want it to, because it can change. I was told it can change to something else, or it can change back. Like, there's not really much known about it.
And you cannot physically do your old accent now?
No, not at all, no. I can't even, like, think about it sometimes. It's like a complete block in my brain.
Does it feel like a completely different person?
Yeah. When it first happened, I really struggled with, like, I felt like I'd lost myself, lost my identity. But now I feel like I found myself again. And I love it, yeah.
So just to go back, so all began when you were diagnosed with functional neurological disorder.
Yeah.
Was it chronic hemiplegic?
Yeah, hemiplegic.
So explain that to us.
So I started having migraines when I was 8 years old.
Poor thing.
So, and so the hemiplegic side is where like you get an aura, so my vision changes, and I used to get like numbness in the left side of my body, mainly my arm. But when I came to about 20 or 21 years old, they diagnosed me with chronic ones because I was having more than like 25 a month. It was literally every day, so bad. So yeah, that's just been something I've always had and kind of got used to. And then,
So talk me through when you.
So she has a couple of clear characteristics like the oohs and the e's instead of the diphthongs in standard British English. So they are rather strong cues for Newcastle English, in fact. I mean, I have the impression that she actually overdoes it and really emphasizes that as a strong cue here. Of course, I don't know her medical history. Later in the program, they invite a neurologist who, in fact, says she has its functional neurologic disorder, and conversion disorder is actually a subcategory of it. So it's about psychological issues that seem to play a role. The speaker has also been on TikTok for a long time, apparently demonstrating the accent. Listen, this is what my new accent sounds like. And I bet that if you were to look at the different time frames of those recordings, you notice that, I mean, initially she's rather inconsistent in the accent, but sort of optimizes, becomes better at portraying, at using the accent to portray that new identity, as it were. And so that is not uncommon in psychogenic speakers. Say they develop, they optimize, they work on the accent, they like the media, they love the media, they get in touch with specialists, sending me emails, for example, if I can call myself a specialist. Dr. Verhoeven, I have foreign accent syndrome. I've seen many medics here in the United States. No one seems to help me. Can you assist in a sense? So that's rather typical, but I think a massive accent change too. And also interesting type of speaker is actually the mixed foreign accent syndrome speaker, who in fact starts off speaking with a foreign accent as a result of neurological damage. And then after a while, in order to portray a coherent foreign identity, starts doing other things as well, to, for example, use, say, the American native speaker of American English who develops a British English accent will then sometimes also start using typical British English words just to make it even more convincing, and not always having to answer the questions, oh, where you're from, and then having to explain, no, but it's actually a speech disorder and the whole thing. And it's often also the kind of speaker who likes to hang around in hotels where, it's quite common, of course, to hear foreign accents so that they don't have to comment all the time. And I have once a speaker here who, again, had a stroke, developed slurring, typical dysarthria features, but puts on an Italian accent that is so strong that I also think did we hear it today a bit? I think an Italian accent.
In Essex, I was born. Where I was brought up, I went to live in a Chigwell in Essex when I was a small child.
So, when you grew up, you spoke just in an ordinary Essex voice?
Oh, as Essex as you come, like the Cockney.
So, at what point did you first notice there was something going wrong?
Back in October 2003, I had a stroke, and I went to work that day, and I was slurring like I was drunk. I work with people with learning disabilities, and one of the clients, he said to me, "Hey, George, you are drunk." I say to him, "No, I'm not drunk. It's just I feel a bit funny today. I feel a bit giddy." My arm was very weak, and my boss, he said to me, "What is wrong with you, George? Is something wrong with you?" I said, "No, I'm okay. I feel okay. I felt well." He said, "I'm going to take you to the hospital. I feel there's something wrong with you." So he take me to the hospital. There we met my wife Kitty, and she come along, and they take me into the hospital and I see the doctor, and he said, "Well, George, I believe you've had a stroke." In the evening, I come home. My wife Kitty, she made an appointment to see the doctor, my doctor. He confirmed that I had a stroke, but I was still slurring at that time. But after a few days, it started to develop into an accent. I don't know where this accent comes from. Some say Greek, some say Italian, but I have been speaking with Italian people, and they say it sounds like someone from southern Italian.
Have you ever been to that part of the world?
I've never ever been to Italy. I have been to Greece many a times. I've been to Spain many a times. I've been many places, but I've never ever been to Italy. This is a country I want to go to at a later stage because I like to see everything in Italy.
Yeah. I mean, obviously difficult to provide strong evidence for this being a mixed speaker. But I would imagine it is. So 3 types. I haven't mentioned developmental foreign accent syndrome. You know, that's even more uncommon. You know, that's foreign accent syndrome in children as a result of childhood apraxia speech, for example, but also very often associated with autism spectrum disorder, which I've never had an opportunity to actually hear, but I often get that feedback. I mean, these children are interesting in this respect too. Okay, now I suppose that gives you a little bit of a sort of background in the different speakers with foreign accent syndrome. And what I wanted to focus on a little bit today is the phonetic characteristics that have been reported in the past in those speakers. And I thought, it might just be a very good idea to collect all the cases that we can find and have a look at what types of errors that have been reported. And well, what did we do? We collected all the publications on foreign accent syndrome between 1907 and 2018. Since then, there are still examples that have been published, so I'm including these, you know, as not as we speak, but as of next week, I would imagine. Regular searches in databases, references, cross-referencing, have spent quite a bit of time to actually collect these data, but only official published peer-reviewed publications in books, textbooks, peer-reviewed proceedings, for example, or specialist journals, either medical or in speech. We collected, as a result of that, a total of 89 publications that we have included in the survey here. But I think the important distinction was important to keep in mind, had to be peer-reviewed, and so that there's a quality label, and we have really excluded everything that was not peer-reviewed or cases published in articles, newspaper articles, in social media and so on. We did not include those, in fact. So anything informal was not withheld. And we collected information, of course, that was useful information in terms of the patients, what are the patient characteristics, both demographically as neurologically, for example. So that's not the topic of today. That is something you can read about. Phonetic information is something we really collected systematically, and that was not always easy. Because obviously the way in which that phonetic information is reported in articles, I mean, there's loads of variability in terms of terminology, but also variability in terms of the detail that is provided by the people who describe the accent. So I mean, we have found things like, well, this speaker, there was a lot of stopping of fricatives. So we consider that as one observation, as it were. Sometimes you get more detail. The velar stop k was realized as the fricative ch. So again, we consider that as one single observation. But sometimes you get something vague, like there was extensive devoicing of stops and fricatives. You have no idea about the frequencies there. So we also consider that as a single observation. So you notice already there's already some variability in trying to quantify this. But sometimes, you get something like there was extensive devoicing of stops and fricatives, and the clinician gives us 4 examples of that. That was counted as 4 observations. And sort of the idea being a little bit, if one can easily quote 4 or 5 or 6 examples, it must have been a very prominent feature of this individual speaker. So. And we've really tried to collect the data in all of these articles, reinterpret the data into a unified phonetic taxonomical framework, and also have these double-checked, so that we did this with 2 people independently of one another. Obviously, we did find differences in classification, so we will go back, look at it again, just to make sure that we were really as consistent as we possibly could in the data collection. And then, we ended up with a long list of 188 errors that have been described, have been found. And what we did was we classified all these errors in terms of the articulatory mechanism that was affected. And and we have been hoping to find errors with respect to the airstream mechanism involved, but we didn't. In fact, not a single mention of it. Phonation, quite a lot of observations had to do with phonation, with voicing, with intonation, with voice quality in particular. And so that was actually a rather common category. Of course, also in terms of articulation, both constriction type, so the degree of the constriction involved, as well as the location of that constriction, so place of articulation was taken, was labeled, and also coordination issues between segments. such as excessive aspiration, for example. So in French, the voiceless plosives are unaspirated, and then it becomes, in Dutch, becomes quite significant. Like in Dutch, you say cut, that should not be there in any way. In English, so that relates to aspiration, but also affrication is a very common phenomenon here. Things like ik loop is something that you read about and you notice quite a bit in speakers with foreign accent syndrome. And that gave us an extensive list of observations, as you can see, 1,188. So we'll end up with having a few more soon. But you notice what we get. So the affected sound here, that was a fricative. What did we learn about the fricative? Sometimes not a lot. In fact, sometimes it just said, yeah, the fricatives are distorted. That's not so informative. But it applies to the consonants, of course. That is something we kept track of, the labels and the paper in which those observations were found, so that we can go back if we need to do that at some point. But you notice affected sounds, fricatives, plosives, approximants are often affected. There you are. Trills, if the language has trills, plosives, word stress, intonation is actually a quite common category. In fact, everyone looks at intonation. And I think one of the reasons is that historically also one of the earlier publications about a Norwegian or two Norwegian patients with foreign accent syndrome, it was a strong argument that the intonational system and the pitch accent system very specifically in the language was disturbed. And that sort of, I think, opens the eyes of any clinician researcher to listen carefully, extra carefully to intonation. And so word stress often affected, speech rate often affected, like longer duration of utterances, longer syllables, lack of durational control, rhythm, again, so staccato, rhythm. At least it gives you a little bit of an idea of what that collection looked like. And in dealing with this statistically, which we haven't done much, but in order to quantify it a bit, we sort of tried to come up with, all kinds of nice mathematics that capture these phenomena and quantify them. But we sort of had error frequency, how often, very simple, how often does an error occur? How often is it reported? But also error prevalence is something that we took into account. And so is a particular error reported very often in different speakers in different publications. So I thought it would be nice to use both measures a bit to get a view on what seems to be more prominent and less prominent. And it was the idea that we would just do something like error frequency plus error prevalence times 1.25 divided by 2. I mean, some weighting essentially added to all of this, but that hasn't really taken me all that far, I'm afraid to say. So it gives you things like this, where if you look at the segmental errors versus the suprasegmental errors, it's pretty clear that the segmentals overall are in fact somewhat more common than suprasegmental errors. But you know, if you look at the prevalence, then it is clear that intonation, rhythm, prosodic features are more commonly reported generally in the literature than if you compare that to segmental aspects. So that gives a little bit of a feel. And if you look at the actual distributions then of sound classes affected, it's you know, not difficult to see that the vowels stand out from all the rest, both in terms of prevalence as well as in terms of specific frequencies. So the vowels, the fricatives, the plosives, you know, those are really determined, seem to play an important role in causing the foreign accent perception. Yeah. Of course, I shouldn't, maybe let me just say that, of course, there's a lot of noise in that collection. As I'm sure you're aware, I mean, there's lots of differences between clinicians, between individual researchers. Some have a keen ear, some don't. You know, some have lots of experience listening to speech. Others clearly have far less experience. So that obviously is sort of the elephant in the diagram, as it were, because that is also a very important determining factor in all of those reports. So let me just have a look at you know, these different categories in a little bit more detail. And looking at the vowels, what you typically get, I mean, there are obviously far more errors reported in the vowels, but these were the three most frequent ones. And it's quite clear that vowel reduction is a very important category. So the reduction, the more centralized realization of the peripheral vowels is a very significant factor, apparently. Also, a durational aspect, but the duration of the vowels features rather frequently, and strengthening of the vowels, and that can mean a variety of things, but often related to a strong onset of the vowel, a creaky voice, a tense voice quality in the vowel can relate to that. And just to give you an example of how strong that reduction can be, so these are data from a client that we discussed last week, in fact, and we compared her vowels. And these are the ones in the foreign accent syndrome speaker, and these mean vowel qualities are associated, are the ones of a reference sample, 20 female native speakers of Belgian Standard Dutch, so same regional variety, same gender, same age, very similar in age, so that's what we were able to control for. Similar type of data collection, isolated words in both cases, not to have effect of conversational speech. I mean, it really leads to a rather significant reduction of the vowels per se. And what we've done is, of course, we've normalized the formant frequencies by means of a Z-score transformation. In the back vowels, yeah, that does not seem to cause much of confusion. It looks like the vowels are still fairly well distinguished in an acoustic perspective, but it's especially here in this particular area here of the vowel space that the qualities, are so reduced that they are no longer well distinguished. And in fact, the speaker did not do any u's, but in Dutch you also have an u in that area, and did not do any us either, which is also sort of situated in that area, so that you get a lot of crowding in that area as a result of it, whereas in standard Dutch and unaffected speakers, the actual acoustic qualities are quite distinct. And I would also say, some of the changes that you see here, specifically that distinction between I and I in this speaker almost disappears, the result of which is, and that is not, how shall I say, potentially not the result of motor issues in the speaker, but the reflection of a local accent in her speech. And that's sort of an underlying factor that we also have to take into account, because that one, as such, can be quite supportive of a French accent in Dutch. So there's all kinds of different strands and phenomena that are taking place that we have to be careful with in accounting for the foreign accents as such. Okay, fricatives. What happened to the fricatives? That was, the second most frequent category that was affected, both in terms of prevalence, in terms of actual quantification, not so common. That was the one that we should be looking at. A lot of stopping of the fricatives. So overshoot, so that the speakers realize a plosive rather than a fricative. And very typical in standard Dutch, we have a uvula, a voiced uvula fricative, and that, in our speaker here is then realized as g. Gehad, the speaker says gehad. And that again is almost a prototypical feature of a French accent in Dutch. So that's a very common problem here. And then we've got deletions. The fricative drops out completely. It is deleted. Often related to syllable structure, often related to clusters, like in sch in Dutch, schaap. The speaker will say saap. That cluster reduction is the result from fricative deletion here, and that's quite common in other motor speech disorders too. And devoicing. So I'm just checking the colors here, and that's actually deletion. That is devoicing. So devoicing, where the voiced fricative is realized as a voiceless one, or a partially voiceless fricative. And then again, the article scream. This is a hallmark feature, but obviously, as we all know, it's a very common phenomenon in languages of the world. Fricatives, voiced fricatives, get devoiced. We all do it. We've collected reference data for Dutch, and in fact, you do notice that the voiced fricatives here and the devoiced ones are incredibly frequent almost in terms of at least the presence and absence of vocal fold vibration, if we were to take that as a strong cue for voicing and devoicing, the absence of it. Okay, so a natural phenomenon that obviously in the context, in this clinical context, in a way is held against the speaker. Plosives, again, voicing problems, very common in those speakers. Also quite a large number of deletions, and I would say often related to cluster reduction with plosives in there, and coordination issues specifically relating to aspiration and affrication. That I think is an important one, where you get that strengthening effect also in the release of plosives here. Okay. And then, other categories that we looked at, approximates. Most commonly reported strengthening of the approximants so that they're realized as fricatives or as plosives or deletions, so quite common. Trills, I've labeled it here, backing. I'm afraid that we are a bit responsible for that observation in those speakers, because in Belgian Standard Dutch, you've got either a tongue-tip trill, an alveolar trill, or a uvular trill. Both are acceptable. But in fact, in all the speakers that we have reported, there was a clear change from an alveolar trill to a uvular trill. And so that, this is probably, my own doing here. That's what I mean. So uvular trills instead of alveolar trills. Diphthongs, diphthong dynamics that have been affected. That's also quite common observation. I mean, you've just heard it, in fact, where in the Geordie speaker, the Newcastle speaker, who uses O instead of O, and who uses says A instead of A. And so monophthongization of the fricatives seems to be actually quite common too. Lateral approximants. What is quite common is palatalization of the lateral approximant in syllable final position, for example, where in Dutch it should be actually a dark L, veil, so velarized, but often you get palatalization veil instead of veil, and that obviously also creates a perceptual impression potentially of non-nativeness. I would say of a German accent in Standard Dutch, in fact. There you find this quite often. Fronting in the nasals, where an alveolar nasal or a velar nasal is realized as either alveolar or labial. So fronting of the nasals, weakening of the affricates, so where the plosive part drops out, so that you only have the fricative left, and taps in American English that are often lengthened according to reports, so that it becomes a more regular voiced plosive with a longer medial phase. So that is the picture that is emerging really in terms of the segmentals. In terms of suprasegmentals, you know, there's a lot of attention to intonation, speech rate, rhythm, pausing, articulatory settings, generally in a labor perspective, sentence stress, lexical stress. You know, and sometimes you get quite detailed comments that are informative, but, you know, something like intonation is strange. That's very unhelpful in any phonetic perspective. Or speech rate slow. At least that means something. Rhythm often staccato, so that there is a change towards isochrony, going from stress timing to syllable timing. If I, you know, talk behind the scenes, staccato rhythm, pauses that are frequent and long, and that may have an effect on intonational issues. In fact, as we'll see in a bit, articulatory setting is often tense. So we're talking here often about creaky voice, harsh voices, but creaky voice that tends to be a fairly tense setting, at least in a medial perspective, with a lot of adductive tension, a lot of medial compression on the vocal folds, but maybe fairly relaxed setting in terms of longitudinal tension as such. Sentence stress, placement errors, and also in terms of lexical stress that can go wrong stress placement, like in one of the speakers that we listen to, you get things like, instead of water in Dutch, water. And if you add that up, for example, instantie, that's in fact quite typical actually in a French accent in Standard Dutch, in learners of Standard Dutch. So that I think gives you a rather complete overview. What could that mean? Well, I had a very close look at a neurogenic speaker that we were able to record. And, you know, I did a very, so in Dutch we have, as some of you know, no doubt know, an excellent grammar of Dutch intonation that was developed in the 1960s, 70s by René Collier and Hans het Hart at the Institute of Perception Research. I mean, Toby is a far development from that in a sense. But the nice thing about that analysis was that they came up with a very explicit description of the phonetic characteristics of pitch contours in Dutch. And there have been reference studies whereby we actually know which types of, where we know the frequencies of pitch contours in Standard Dutch. And I don't know, but maybe useful to say that the method they used, I like to talk about it because René Collier was my professor of phonetics in a very distant past. Stylization was in fact replacing intonation contours, pitch patterns by a minimal specification of straight lines. So the blue curve here in standard praat fashion is in fact the fundamental frequency with a lot of little ups and downs and what have you. Stylization is in fact the replacement of that line by a minimal specification of straight line segments. So you can iron out this little curve here, replace it by a straight line, And in fact, it's very difficult, if at all possible, to hear the distinction between the two. And, you know, that rise and fall, you can just again iron out, replace them by a rising pitch movement and a falling pitch movement, and so on, and so on, and so on. So they applied that technique to something like 1,500 Dutch utterances, wide variety of contexts, conversational speech, theatre, television, news readings. And on that basis, they came up with an inventory of all the perceptually relevant pitch movements in Dutch. What does that sound like? By the way, that pattern here, and so it's a fall rise, so third stress, and then a rise, the pitch stays high and declines, and the second, the last sentence stress is realized by means of a fall. And so this is it.
We gaan vanavond in ieder geval naar de Schouwburg.
So it's, sorry, a bit louder.
We gaan vanavond in ieder geval naar de Schouwburg.
And if you want to listen to it in detail.
We gaan vanavond in ieder geval naar de Schouwburg.
Ieder geval naar de Schouwburg. So, and this one is the most basic intonation pattern in standard Dutch. This one is only possible in certain prosodic contexts. That is, and the last but one and final sentence stress can be realized by this pattern as such. So as a result of that, you know, we have a very detailed inventory of pitch patterns in Dutch that has been around for a long time. And I'm beginning to fear that many people, in fact, have already forgotten about by now. And because, you know, that really dates back to speech technology of the 1960s, 70s, sponsored by Philips, in fact. Do I need to say, you know, that typical, here's another example of that really initial rise, fall, word stress on an individual utterance.
Jan durft niet onder de auto te kijken.
So it's that person, Jan, who, okay, I don't, do I need to say more about this? I mean, I'm sure you're all well informed about internet. Maybe this one is one in which the pitch is reset to the base level without actually creating a stress on that particular syllable. So we gaan overmorgen, the pitch stays high, naar de bioscoop. And that inconspicuous reset of the pitch really is a very strong marker, boundary marker, grammatical boundary, communication, turn-taking boundary also. So that's also a very common pattern in Dutch. And the nice thing is, of course, that we have reference data for how common these patterns are in conversational speech. And the blue ones here, that's research done by Grau in 95, so that's a while ago. Perceptual classification of spontaneous and read speech. In fact, those are the reference frequencies. So yeah, reference frequencies, and this is a category rest, none of those. And we looked at how frequent those patterns were in the client that we discussed last session. And you notice in fact that, you know, all three all the different patterns do occur legitimately, normally, well-formed in every possible sense, but it's quite clear that 1B pattern and that boundary marking is clearly an issue. So that rising movement, in fact, we gaan overmorgen, which sort of suggests, yeah, boundary, there's still more speech to come, I don't want to lose the speaking turn, and so on, is extremely frequent as compared to the references in Standard Dutch. Yeah? And then I find that an interesting observation, because it seems to suggest, well, I mentioned in this particular speaker, there's lots of pausing in the speech, and I mean a lot, and the pauses are relatively long on each case. So the speaker at almost every boundary is risking to lose the speaking turn, and it's in fact using that rising pattern that she seems to use as a strategy to actually keep the speaking turn and tell the clinician, hang on, still want to go on. That is also, not just in this particular client, but I mean, Anja Kushman in Glasgow, in fact, did a dissertation also on foreign accent syndrome. And then, in fact, in all the speakers that she describes, she actually finds exactly the same. And so slow speech rate, rising pitch movements in excess. So, and here, for example, you see this particular speaker, and you notice it goes up, 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 up again. And this is what it sounds like. I had a stroke 2 weeks ago. That's what she says.
Ik heb 2 weken geleden een CPR gedaan en sindsdien ben ik gedeeltelijk verlamd.
Also the starting up issue with the velar plosive instead of the velar fricative. Maar ik heb 2 weken geleden een CVA gedaan. And I think it's strategic by the speaker here. All right. Speech rate is another issue that I mentioned earlier on. Again, for Dutch, we are lucky, it's maybe not lucky. We were inspired to look at speech rate at some point, trying to find out whether, do we find regional differences in Flanders and the Netherlands? And it looks that we were able to show that in the Netherlands, in fact, the speech delivery rate is significantly faster than in Belgium, Standard Dutch, both in terms of articulation rate, so excluding pauses, as in terms of speaking rate. I said that correctly, I hope, but speaking rate, in fact, including pauses. So articulation rate, excluding speaking rate, including pauses. And you see in standard values, and this is the reflection of speech rates in 160 speakers, 80 male, 80 female, 4 different regions in the Netherlands and in Flanders. So about 4 to 5.5 syllables per second. And our speaker with foreign accent syndrome, 2.80 syllables per second. So that's quite significantly lower. And also in terms of speaking rate, of course, again, a rather low speaking rate as compared to the, let's say, reference speakers. You know? Okay, and also, finally, in terms of rhythm, so you'll know this particular picture from Grabe's publication on the pairwise variability index, just exemplifying different languages in terms of rhythmical differences between them on the basis of this index. So we have calculated that index for our foreign accent syndrome speaker here before the insult. So we have a short stretch of speech where she read, in fact, a couple of sentence utterances. So you notice that in terms of that PVI, it's on the side of what can be expected of Germanic languages. And in fact, after the stroke, she has syllable timed, clearly syllable timed PVI, sort of, being a very close neighbor to French in that respect. So all kinds of changes that are relevant and that contribute to the foreign accent perception potentially, and basically trying to, I've been thinking about this a bit, how can you deal with that in a slightly more comprehensive philosophical framework? What does that mean? How does foreign accent work? How does it get triggered? What do people rely on? And then I would say really that in the first instance, I'd say that some of the errors, that are made by individuals, they are really compatible of what you would expect in a real foreign accent. So, the devoicing of word final plosives and fricatives in English, for example, clearly, a typical feature of a foreign accent in English, as you know. But the uvula R in Dutch, again, if it's, not polished enough, it really conjures up, that reminds us of a French foreign accent, or the strengthening of the velar fricative. I mean, you can name a couple of those features that seem to push a listener in the direction, yeah, this is a French accent potentially, if you want to make sense of it. So these trigger the perception of a foreign accent. And then, there are, of course, all kinds of characteristics naturally present in the person's speech, like natural processes and languages of the world, like devoicing of stops and fricatives in non-final contexts, but generally, that can support that perception of a foreign accent. So that's conducive. And also some characteristics of the speaker's natural regional dialect or accent that have not been affected in any way by the stroke, for example, and speech production issues, they can then get reinterpreted as being supportive generally of the foreign accent perception. I think that also plays potentially an important role, like the distinction between E and I in Dutch is a distinction you do not have in the Antwerp variety of Dutch. It's a distinction that French learners of Dutch don't make either. So a regional accent feature becomes suggestive and supportive of the interpretation of a French foreign accent, and that may actually reinforce that foreign accent perception. That's what I'd like to think. If you put this even in a bit of a broader philosophical framework that was developed by, okay, let me just get rid of the highlight there. A couple of terms developed by John Lever and Trudgill in a paper 1970s. I don't know the exact date, but he sort of refers to communicative and informative features in speech, and develops in the wake of David Abercrombie, you know, a whole taxonomy of markers in speech. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but I think that communicative versus informative aspect of speech is quite relevant. And Lever uses basically here the Lyons definition. A signal is communicative if it is intended by the sender to make the receiver aware of something of which he was not previously aware. Then the signal is communicative. And so the listener becomes aware of something, and it's intended to be like that, to have that effect. And a signal is informative regardless of what the speaker intends to do. It's informative if the receiver becomes aware of something that they weren't aware before, in fact. And, you know, you notice that I've got regulative information, symbolic, but also semantic information. You know, that's probably all more on the communicative information side of communication, whereas here evidential information is more on the informative side of the communicative situation. You know, information about the speaker, age, weight, body posture, gender, but also speech community. Things like, is the speaker from Paris or from Boulogne-sur-Mer? Social aspects of speech that fall into that category. But you know, that relates a lot to accent features that can be informative in this regard, but also a speaking situation, whispering in the library. And the actual speaking situation requires speakers to be quiet, whisper, but also perceptions of the listener that may be reflected in speech. Hearing impairment, so we'll raise the speed, the volume to make ourselves understood. And so a lot of evidential information, and it's actually that foreign accent syndrome that, you know, is very much related to all that evidential information. And interestingly, oh no, I was clicking the wrong place here, but Lever and Trudgill, they make a distinction between actual markers and apparent markers in their article. And so actual markers, they accurately indicate a true characteristic of the speaker. And so you hear a voice, you recognize an accent, a Dutch accent in English, and indeed, the speaker is from Antwerp. So that would then be regarded as an actual marker. But there are also apparent markers in their taxonomy, which in fact do not indicate a true characteristic of the speaker. And so you think, oh, yes, I hear an accent. When I try to speak a bit of French, the first comment I got, you must be from Belgium, really. An actual marker, yes, I am from Belgium, but if I say no, I'm really English in background, it would have had to be conceived as an apparent marker. It does not reflect a true characteristic, and they further, distinguish between misinterpreted markers and misleading markers. And the misinterpreted ones, in fact, are characteristics that you think, in fact, are informative about disease, for example, but, in fact, they're not. They are markers of regional characteristics. And so you, as a listener, you misinterpret a set of information, whereas the misleading markers, they do not, suggest true characteristic of the speaker, but they are deliberately created by the speaker or developed by the speaker to portray. They say, I like the English phrase here, in order to lay claim to characteristics of identity which are not actually theirs. So that's misleading in that context. I hope you're beginning to see what I'm getting at, and that foreign accent syndrome is in fact, an apparent marker. Here, it's an apparent marker. It's not an actual marker. If you look, you can, on that basis, possibly make a distinction here between foreign accent syndrome as a misinterpreted marker or as a misleading marker. So neurogenic versus psychogenic in a bit of a taxonomical perspective. And I've been thinking about this, and my thinking is definitely not final in that respect, and possibly faulty, and I'm very open to suggestions and discussion about it. But in this particular context, you could say that the speaker has no deliberate intention to sound foreign in a misinterpreted foreign accent syndrome. They don't want to do, that's not their intention. Whereas in misleading foreign accent syndrome, so the psychogenic cases, the speaker has not deliberate, but a more or less stronger or less strong desire to sound foreign. So the speaker actively strives to sound foreign. I think that's a nice distinction between the two. And you, of course, can also say this one results from physical damage, damage to the speech production pathways and mechanism, whereas the misleading foreign accent syndrome does not result from physical damage. So it's the consequence of psychogenic factors. Misinterpreted foreign accent syndrome is acquired. I mean, in a speech pathology sense, acquired. It results, obviously, from the loss of control over the speech production process, either from planning or execution issues that are affected, whereas the misleading foreign accent syndrome is not acquired. That's actually no evidence of any loss of speech production control as such. And what else is there? Misinterpreted, it resides in the speaker. And so it's actually the speaker who generates speech that reflects what could be a foreign accent, whereas in the misleading foreign accent syndrome, Did I say that correctly? I didn't say that correctly. I think so. It resides in the listener, the misinterpreted foreign accent syndrome, whereas the misleading foreign accent syndrome mainly resides in the speaker. It's the speaker who wants to portray a particular perception of their identity and linguistic background. Misinterpreted, I think also relevant is that it is mainly speech that is affected. It's actually very rare that you'll find foreign accent syndrome speakers with language breakdown. It does occur, but not very often. Whereas in misleading foreign accent syndrome, speakers tend to be aware that it's not just about speech, the foreign accent. So, you know, there may also be linguistic issues. And so they do often have also linguistic issues, as long as they can be suggestive of a foreign accent. And maybe finally, I don't know, misinterpreted foreign accent syndrome. So it results in the perception of a change in identity, but that leads to psychological distress. That's, I think, something you read about very often, that's reported very often. Being taken, you know, for a non-native speaker of the accent that I've grown up in, that is part of my identity. You know, that's no longer the case. It leads to an identity crisis that people find very difficult to deal with at an emotional level, whereas the misleading foreign accent syndrome situation really also results in a change of identity, often, but it actually leads to psychological gratification. Somehow, it helps the speaker, and maybe in terms of prestige. So where the newly acquired foreign accent actually gives the speaker a higher social status, and you know, that can be psychologically interesting. You know? So that's sort of what I've been thinking about in terms of you know, a taxonomical approach to it. And in fact, and I wish now, suppose that I could sort of, I don't want to disadvantage anyone on Zoom, but of course this is being recorded. But I would say in privacy, you know, you could actually think that foreign accent syndrome is a fake syndrome. It happens to be the result of coincidence. The coincidence of a specific constellation of features that, since, you know, speakers and listeners are cooperative in a communicative situation, are very willing to hear and to accept this is normal. Yeah, it's a foreign accent, so the speaker must be, and so speakers will not typically think, that's a motor speech disorder, for example. And so in that sense, you know, maybe one could say there's, you know, a lot to do about not very much. And maybe we are confusing the picture by doing a lot of research on foreign accent syndrome, which in fact may just be ataxia speech or dysarthria, or a combination of dysarthria and a mild aphasia, for example, that gives rise to a specific foreign accent perception. I saw that article that was published by Jennifer Gerd from Oxford University. She has this title, "It's in the Ear of the Beholder." At, you know, a very early stage of foreign accent research, sort of suggesting yeah, it's actually the listener that creates that perception. And, you know, it's much less about the speaker in this particular case. Okay. at some point we started, you know, to collect maybe a bit of additional evidence in this respect. Did some accent attribution experiments in the Flanders area with speakers with a real foreign accent, and that we were 100% certain this is now very prototypical German accent in Dutch, English accent in Dutch. We recorded those speakers. Also unimpaired native speaker controls, where we had speakers from the Netherlandic standard variety and the Belgian standard variety, and speakers with foreign accent syndrome that we recorded in the past. And so we had five speakers involved, speech samples, and those were played to 123 native speakers of Belgian standard Dutch. And those speakers, that listening panel, in fact, differed in terms of their familiarity with foreign accents and judging foreign accents. And we had, well, this is now, we take one step back. Sorry for that. And so the real foreign accents that we use, the German foreign accent in Dutch, the English, Korean, Canadian, French foreign accents. And we had 5 unimpaired speakers and 5 with foreign accent syndrome, also from the Belgian region, as well as the Northern Dutch standard was important to control for that. The speech samples were all taken from informal interviews. Now we discussed last time, you know, how controlled does this have to be? Ideally, yes, but obviously in the foreign accent syndrome speakers case, we had informal interviews. Tell us about your hobbies, what happened to you, so conversational speech, and we elicited similar conversations with the speakers with real foreign accents. A bit of neutral content, of course. It should not give away the linguistic background of the speaker, so we made sure that we didn't have things like, what's your national dish? Yeah, waffles, for example. That would definitely give away the Belgian background. And duration, a bit variable as well, but sort of, you know, half a minute to a minute and a half worth of speech, depending really on availability. What did we do? So we had 3 groups of speakers. We had students, all of them were students, in fact, but there were quite a number of them who did not have any formal training in languages, in listening to foreign accents and so on. So you could say there were in fact psychology students from VUB in Brussels, and you know, let's call them naive, no experience in that developed experience. We had speech and language therapists who obviously were very familiar with motor speech disorders, all trained at University of Ghent in Belgium. And we also had teachers of Dutch as a foreign language, so who, of course, have experience in dealing with assessing foreign accents, and, you know, with quite extensive experience. And basically the question was, you know, here are a couple of speakers, listen to them, you know, what accent do you hear? So an accent attribution experiment, free reign, so nothing predetermined on paper. So everyone was able to say what they thought they heard. And as you can see, it's a quite wide range of different accents that were suggested. Sometimes there was a lot of variability in the accent that was attributed, and that was actually very typical for the foreign accent syndrome speakers. So that had really the widest variation in kinds of accents. And the unimpaired native speakers, they were almost 100% recognized as either from Belgium or the Netherlands. So very accurate. And only 2 accents that were attributed, so never any mistake. The real foreign accent, also quite a bit of variability, but a bit less so than in the foreign accent syndrome case. And we use that as the input for a correspondence analysis. And that is basically a graphics technique that I'm always told that is a very popular technique in France. To apply, it's not a statistical technique, but it transforms that matrix into a 2-dimensional space that sort of expresses strength of relationship between variables. And if you look at this, can I blow this up a little bit more maybe? It looks like you get 3 groups of speakers here that are recognized, and they're fairly consistent groups, in fact. And so we've got the native speaker controls, but I mean, the difference between the two is that, we've got speakers from Belgium and from the Netherlands, so Holland, let's say, okay, that they feature differently on the chart is normal, but more on the native speaker side, as it were. Then you've got a group of speakers, and that entails speakers with a real foreign accent, so they cluster together. The German accent, the Southern European accent, which in fact we didn't have in the sample, but the North American accent we did have in the sample, with Canadian English and the British English one as well. But clearly a group of speakers that are regarded as similar in accent realization. And the foreign accent syndrome ones, in fact, sit nicely between the 2 other groups in terms of accent attribution. In fact, all of them, no, except the number 15 here, but those 4 speakers are very, close together, meaning they're very similar in the attribution that was made. And, what were they assigned? A French accent and a Moroccan accent. And those are the two accents that listeners in Flanders are very, very, very familiar with, in fact. So very sensitive too. So the foreign accent syndrome sits between the group of native speakers and the group of real foreign accents. And so you could say they're not as foreign as a real foreign accent, but not as native as a native accent either. So it's a bit of an ambiguous group. And that's sort of reflected in other measures too, in fact. So being asked, is this a native speaker of Dutch that you hear? Of course, no surprise that the real native speakers really definitely almost 100% unanimous choice for definitely. The real foreign accents come out most poorly in that sense, in that, those are definitely not native speakers of Dutch. And the foreign accent syndrome speakers are neatly in between, about a 50% chance level. And in fact, we don't know really, and that's the implication of it. And also in terms of agreement, how well did those listeners agree on judging the foreign accent? They did extremely well. And the native speakers did not do brilliantly on the real foreign accents. They did not agree on the types of accents necessarily. But agreement is lowest in the foreign accent syndrome case. Probably not a significant difference between the two groups, but again, in the broader picture, that can be informative. And how confident were you in assigning the accent? Did you feel comfortable? Was that difficult to do in the native speakers and in the real foreign accents? You could say either extremely to fairly confident. That's how raters felt, but they were not comfortable at all, confident at least at all, in judging the foreign accent syndrome speakers. So, what I would like to conclude is that sort of foreign accent syndrome in this whole judgment and accent attribution test, in fact, occupies a position between real foreign accent and native accent. It does not sound as foreign, apparently, as a real foreign accent. It does not sound as native as the native controls, in fact. And, foreign accent syndrome is typically associated with a phonetic. It quantifies a number of perceptions of judges listening to foreign accents and foreign accent syndrome as such. So I will keep thinking in that perspective, if that seems useful. When I say, I often think it's a bit of a fake syndrome. That does not mean, I'm not saying, okay, we should just brush it off the table and ignore the fact that speakers complain about it or are recognized like that, because of course, it in a clinical perspective may really affect them in terms of their identity and so on. So that's not the message I'm trying to give here, but I'm trying to put this into a broader taxonomical perspective, in the sense that these speakers can also be very informative about, just the communicative setting of speech and what goes on between speakers and listeners. That's what I'm sort of trying to argue, in fact. And if you do have any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to take them, of course.